Okay, Pei Zion Amud Beis, 87b. About a quarter from the top of the page. And the line begins with the word that we are starting with, which is Taf Reish Tan Rabbanan. So we kind of begin a new section now. We discussed Tshuva on various levels, and I'm going to continue with that, but specifically in the context of Yom Kippur, which is really what this whole tractate is about. The tractate is called Yoma, which literally translates as the day, the one day of year being Yom Kippur. The last chapter, which we dedicated this class to for the last few almost months now, is to the day of Yom Kippur in modern times, as opposed to the first 7 chapters, which talk about the proceedings of Yom Kippur in the temple times. So this chapter kind of began with the laws of Yom Kippur in terms of not eating leather shoes, marital relations, all that kind of thing. We spent some time doing that with the halacha. Then we got into the discussion on teshuvah, because that's the next point of Yom Kippur, which is besides the technical laws of Yom Kippur, there's this the spirit, the messaging of Yom Kippur, which is about teshuvah. And now we kind of get into like a kind of bridge between the two and like the halachas of teshuvah. Right? Because as we explained, the essence of teshuvah is a person's decision-making to return to Hashem. But along with that, there are things a person has to do. Regret, specifically divided into 2, regret from the past and accepting for going forward. But then even more technically, there is the mitzvah of vidui, the mitzvah to confess one's sins. This is a bit of a disputed issue, but just to make this point, the Rabbi points out that in Sefer Mitzvahs, in the Rambam's book of Mitzvahs, or besides the Rambam's 14-volume book of laws, the Rambam wrote earlier in his life, earlier in his life, a book which gives a concise dictionary description or dictionary summary of each of the 613 mitzvahs. Now, when it comes to the mitzvah of teshuvah, the Rambam does not write that mitzvah number or whatever it is to do teshuvah. That's not what he writes. He writes the mitzvah is that when you do teshuvah, you should say vidu, you should confess. And Rabbi points out that the reason for that is perhaps the language is a bit different than his book of laws, but in Sefer Mitzvahs, that's his language. And the reason Rabbi says perhaps is because the mitzvah of teshuvah it's not specific enough to be counted as 613. In Rambam's introduction to his book of laws, he writes the methods by which he's determined what's considered a part of the 613, right? When you read the Torah, it's hard to know which parts, like when the Torah says the same thing twice, is it 2 different mitzvahs or is it one mitzvah divided into 2? Let's say tefillin, is that one mitzvah or is it 2 mitzvahs, for example? How many mitzvahs is Shabbos? A negative and a positive, okay, but is there more? Because the Torah says it more than one time. So there are rules that the Rambam sets out for how he determines what's a mitzvah. And then he says any mitzvah which is all-encompassing, it doesn't count as a mitzvah. For example, Torah says, thou shalt be holy. That's not a mitzvah, because what's the specific action? It's a generalistic statement about all the actions. So the Rebbe therefore suggests, considering that which the Alter Rebbe writes, that teshuvah is a decision to, from now on, serve Hashem, it's too generalistic to count it as a mitzvah. And the mitzvah has to have something specific. And therefore, what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is, when you do teshuvah, you do the specific action of saying confession. All to say that it's a separate element within teshuvah. It's not the essence of teshuvah. The essence of teshuvah is not the verbalization, I sinned. The essence of teshuvah is the decision in the heart that I'm no longer going to serve Hashem. So in a way, we can divide the Gemara into 3 sections with respect to teshuvah itself. The first thing was what we hope Hashem is going to do to our teshuvah. What's our objective, our hope? Our hope is Hashem responds with accepting our teshuvah and giving us kapara, giving us atonement. That was the first thing the Gemara discussed, atonement. Then the Gemara got to the essence of teshuvah itself, returning to Hashem. We talked about that out of love, out of fear, and that kind of thing. And even along with that came, if you're truly abandoning sin, then you have to appease your fellow man also, which is the last point. And now we get to the technical part of teshuvah, or the technical part that comes with teshuvah, the vidui, the confession. And that leads us to just the overall order of prayers in Yom Kippur, which is when we verbalize and do these confessions. So that's where we are in the context of this chapter and this tractate. So it's about a quarter from the top of the page, and the line begins with Taf Reish, which stands for Tanu Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, this is a Mishnaic age text. Mitzvahs vidui, the mitzvah of confession is predominantly Erev Yom Kippur im Chashech. Yom Kippur Eve as it gets dark. That is to say, just before Yom Kippur starts. Which is similar to the famous Hayom Yom, which says the day before Yom Kippur is about regretting the past. Yom Kippur itself is about making good resolutions for the future. And therefore, the essence of one's confession, which is all about regretting the past, I did this, and it's all about what I did wrong, that happens primarily, says the Gemara, at Yom Kippur, before as Yom Kippur is beginning. Aval, but no, the beginning of Yom Kippur, the day before Kol Nidre.
Oh.
Before Yom Kippur.
So the complete day, like the night before.
That's correct. The day before, Erev Yom Kippur. Not the night before. Yeah, the night before Ne'ilah, the night before the end, meaning Erev Yom Kippur, just before Kol Nidre, which actually is a custom, by the way. Many have to say Vidui before Kol Nidre. We'll get into that in the details in a moment when we finish this text. So Amar Chacham, our sages said, Yizvada, a person should do confession, in addition to making confession just before Kol Nidre. Yizvada, he should confess before he eats and drinks. Right, so he has a meal just before Yom Kippur starts. So in addition to the confession they should do after his meal, just before Yom Kippur begins, he should also do Yom Kippur Vidui just before he eats and drinks, which is what we do by Mincha time.
Yeah, so I was going to say that's what we say the confessional prayer.
By Mincha. But then we say it again. This is an important custom given what the Gemara just said here now, that after the meal, before Kol Nidre, you just say the confession, even though you're not praying. I don't know if it's a widespread custom, but certainly in Chabad it's a custom. Is that widespread, Rabbi Gimel? Is it? Some do. Certainly in Chabad it's before Kol Nidre, confession. No, it's not said as a minion in Chabad, but it's definitely said individually. Sorry? Mincha, but he says it in Shmanesei. But here the Gemara seems to say that the primary one is the one before Yom Kippur, after your meal before Kol Nidre. And then besides that, the sages added you should do them before you eat at Mincha. Why? As the Gemara explains. Okay, then in theory that's fine, but Mincha is supposed to be done before the meal. Right. He's saying, what if you did?
I'm saying, well, yes, most schools have an earlier Mincha, so you can eat after.
You're supposed to. Mincha, then eat after Mincha.
Yeah. I mean,
correct.
I'm saying, what if you don't do right?
Okay, so then you missed. If you do that, I don't think you have to say the extra Kol Nidre. Is that what you're asking? Like, if you daven Mincha after your meal, do you have to then say the extra confession before Kol Nidre? I would say probably not. Anyway, so why does the Chacham institute you should say Vidui, you should say confession in Mincha, or doesn't say your Mincha, but before the meal, lest he get distracted during his meal and not leave himself time to say the confession before Yom Kippur starts. And Rashi explains why would his mind be distracted? Because he's drinking. Shikras, he gets a little tipsy. It's a Yom Tov meal, so he has some wine, as he's supposed to. So he might get distracted. Okay, so really, Vidui should be just before Kol Nidre. The sages added to also do it before he eats his meal, which is when we do Mincha. So that way, just in case he gets distracted during the meal, he at least covered and said Vidui at least once on Yom Kippur, at least before Yom Kippur starts, he said Vidui, he said confession. Now, even though he does confession at Mincha, before he ate and drank, nonetheless, he should then go again and say Vidui before Kol Nidre after he ate and drank. In other words, one might have thought, I do one Vidui on Erev Yom Kippur, either just before Kol Nidre or before the meal, because the meal might distract me. Says the Gemara, no. Initially do it before Kol Nidre. Now we're telling you to do before the meal, lest your meal distract you. Now, even though you did it before the meal, do it again after the meal. Why? Perhaps during the meal, a person made a mistake and did a sin. So in between his confession of Mincha and his confession before Kol Nidre, which is basically the time of his meal, he may have done a sin. See, the Gemara is very, very understanding of human nature and how quickly it is for someone to sin. On Erev Yom Kippur, he's busy. He's doing all these things. How much time does he have already? But even that guy could happen. Between the confession of Mincha and the confession of Kol Nidre, he may have sinned and therefore should do it again.
Okay, because it's saying once you do Kol Nidre, it's already too late. It's already preparing for the next.
Now from Kippur, it's already the new year.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, says the Gemara, even though now he did confession in the evening, it's not clear what this evening means. L'chora means again during Ma'ariv, which we do during the evening prayer in Yom Kippur, which means now it's the third time he did vidui. He did one by Mincha. He did it just after the meal, just before Kol Nidre. Now he did it again in the evening, which means between his Kol Nidre confession and his Ma'ariv confession, he may have also in theory sinned. And what happened exactly between then and then? He heard a rabbi's speech and said Kol Nidre. But he still may have sinned. His mind goes anywhere, even on Yom Kippur. So it's his third confession now at the evening service. But even though he did that, Isvade Shachris, he should do again confession in the morning. Perhaps during the night, he had some sin he needs to confess for. Shachris, even though he did confession the Shachris in the morning prayer, Isvade b'musaf, he should do confession again at the Musaf prayer. B'musaf, even though he did confession at Musaf, Isvade, he should confess again b'mincha during Mincha. B'mincha, even though he confessed during the Mincha, the afternoon prayer, Yizvada b'ne'ilah, he should again fast in the closing prayer, the ne'ilah prayer at the end of Yom Kippur. So it's a total of 7 times that he's saying the confessional prayer. At Mincha before his meal, after his meal, that's the initial one. Just as we go from pre-Yom Kippur to in Yom Kippur is when he's supposed to do it. That's the primary one. He did it earlier at Mincha just in case his meal distracted him. So he did it twice now. Then he did it again at Ma'ariv, that's 3. Next morning at Shachar, 4. After Shachar, morning prayer, in the Musaf prayer, 5. Mincha, afternoon prayer, 6. And then again, Ne'ilah, 7. It's a total of 7 times. Yes, so we say it again in repetition, but it's one split into 2 in theory.
No, but
we say it together with the chazan in repetition, but in theory it's only one confessional.
So say one more time before you count that. Like one more time before.
I counted that one. 5 prayers and then twice Erev and Kippur. Right, the 5 prayers. But you're right. Every time there's repetition, we do it again also, which means another 4. No, actually, Ne'ilah we don't do it. It's totally the extra 3. It's Shachris, Musaf, and Mincha. Ne'ilah there's no repetition. We don't do it, and Ma'ariv there's no repetition. And Mincha also repetition before we don't do it. So it would make a total of 10. 10 attributes of the soul. Yeah. So, but here the Gemara mentions just the prayers, and I guess the repetition of the Amidah is kind of doing it along with the Chazan, not our initial obligation. Okay, so now the Gemara says, at what juncture should he say this confession? Yachid, an individual, during the silent Amidah, during the undertone Amidah. Michael Chernick is telling me that I shouldn't say silent Amidah because it gives the impression you're supposed to just read it with your eyes. You should say undertone Amidah because you're actually supposed to verbalize it, and he's right. People assume silent Amidah means you don't have to say the word, you just visualize it, When you tell someone, read this book, no one thinks to read it out loud, but should be. Anyway, okay. So at what point should the Yachid, when does the individual who's doing the undertone Amidah, when should he say it? About, sure, verbalizing. You have to be able to hear the words you're actually saying, sure. Halacha. The person next to you shouldn't hear you, but you should hear yourself.
They should hear you, they should understand what you're saying.
Right, they should hear that you're talking, but not hear the words you're saying.
To be like a mumble, instead of be like a mumble.
Yeah, but enough that you can hear the words yourself. Yeah. So, Yachid, when does the individual say it? When he's doing his undertone Amidah. Says the Gemara, Achar Tfilasa, after his prayer. So just to explain, Achar Tfilasa, after his prayer, does not mean it's after the technical prayer, which is after Sim Shalom, which is the last of the 18 or /19 brachas, or on Yom Kippur, actually only 9 or 7, depending on which prayer. But it's after the final bracha of the Amidah. It's before our Amidah theory is over because we still say Elakai Nitzor, and then we take 3 steps back and say Rosh Shalom. But as far as like the legal law goes of us fulfilling our obligation for Amidah, we've done that after we've done some shalom. And that's when we do the confessional prayer. After his prayer, meaning after some shalom, which in theory, which we observe as part of our Amidah, but really the Amidah is over. Now, the Chazan, when he does repetition, he says be'emsa in the middle of his prayer. And the way our custom is, we say it before some shalom. Right? Before we say it before Moedim. Yeah, even before Moedim, at the end of, just before Moedim, yeah. So the brachas, the last two brachas, which are praise of Hashem, come at the conclusion and we do confession just before that, right? I can't remember.
No.
Hold on a second. We say it just before Moedim. So that's right. So the middle set, which is after the first three brachas of praise and the last three brachas of thanks, the middle set, which is about Yom Kippur, we put it in there at the end of that. Okay. So my Amma, what does he say? What does confession look like? Now, we actually do a combination of all of these, at least in the Chabad Siddur. We actually do all of these, but the Gemara here just gives us the opening words. Amar Rav says, the Gemara doesn't tell us like the rest of the text. It assumes you know the text, but it's just telling you what's the primary, I guess, because we do all of them. So maybe the Gemara is addressing what the primary is. Maybe they're saying exclusively. I'm not sure. But this is how the Gemara puts it. Amar Rav says, what should you be saying? You say the verse, the paragraph which begins with the words, you know the secrets of man, and you know the secrets of the world, you know the hidden hearts of the man. And it goes on to say how we are nothing, you are everything, and therefore please forgive us. Shmuel Amar Shmuel says, Mimamake Halev. You say a prayer which begins with the word Mamake Halev. This is the only one I don't recognize, which is why Rashi says, it's a tefillah, don't worry about it. It's a certain kind of prayer. I don't know which prayer this is. I don't think this is part of our Siddur. Is it?
No.
Mamake Alev, Shmuel. That's the only one I think is not in our Siddur. Not that
Lost.
Oh, there you go. It's lost. So Rashi tells us it's a prayer. Don't worry. The other ones Rashi doesn't have to tell us that because we know it from our own text. But here, Rashi just says it's a prayer. I guess it existed and we don't have it.
Pieces of it, all kinds of lost.
Here, interesting. So I guess this is the only one that's not. The Levi says, you say the prayer which begins with the words, and in your Torah it says as follows. As Rashi says, it goes on to say, and we actually do say part of this. Rabbi Yochanan says, you say the paragraph which begins with the word Rabbi Elamim. We aren't relying on our own justice, we're relying on your mercy, as the paragraph goes on to say. That's what Rashi tells us the paragraph is. It says, again, our sins are too numerous to count, and our iniquities are too intense to enumerate. And it goes on to say that you should forgive us, therefore. All of which we say, except for that one from Shmuel. And Hamnuna says, Omar, you should say, before I've been created, I was worthless. Now that I am created, as if I'm also worthless. As if I'm still not created. I am dust in my life. How much more so in my death. Here the Gemara actually does go on to say the whole entire paragraph. Not sure why, but it does. Here I am before you, we say in our prayer. I am before you, like a vessel full of embarrassment and like rot. Maybe there will be before you, God, that I should not sin. That which I have sinned. Please cleanse it in your mercy, but not through any pain. And we actually continue. And then we want to say, so we start with this, and then we go on to the other ones.
So it's interesting if they said the whole thing here. Does that mean we're only supposed to say a little bit of the other ones?
No, maybe it means that this one was less well known at the time, and if the Gemara felt it necessary to record it, it could be that, or maybe the Gemara is indicating to us that this is the primary, but it's not, because the Gemara is going to say Hashem Bagadni is the primary. That's the Gemara is going to go on to say. So I don't know why the Gemara decides to quote the entirety of this one and not the other ones. Maybe the simplest reason is probably because it wasn't as well known. But the Gemara goes on to say, "V'hainu," and this paragraph that we just read from Rav Hamnuna, "Viduya de Rabba," the Rava. This was the confession of Rava, Kula Shasa, all year long, not just on Yom Kippur. With Rav Hamnuna Zuta, and of the minor of Rav Hamnuna, I guess it's a different Rav Hamnuna, but Yom Kippur, this was his confessional on Yom Kippur. Now the Gemara continues. Amar Marzutra said, Loy Amran, all of the above mentioned options or opinions on what is the essence of the confessional prayer. Ella is only true. It's only if you didn't say the paragraph, it goes Aval Anachnu Chatanu, which is basically our Ashamnu. Aval Amar, but if he said Aval Anachnu Chatanu, if he said that confessional, Sulay Tzarech, he doesn't need anything else because that's the essence of confession. The Amar Bar Hamduri, because Bar Hamduri once said, Havakamina Kamed Shmuel, I was standing in the presence of Shmuel, Baba Yosef, and he was sitting, and I guess they were saying all these different prayers. All the prayers mentioned before they were saying. When the Chazan arrived, and he said, he said those words, the confessional, come make him. He got up. So Bar Hamduri said, Shmamina, deduce from that, Ikir Vid, and this is the halacha, Ikir Vid Hayu. The primary of prayer, the primary of confession is this prayer, Chatanu Ashanu. And perhaps we might suggest as follows. The reason why this is the primary. Because all the other ones are like the surroundings of confession. They talk about our worthlessness, God's graciousness, and how we don't rely on our own merit. We're not so arrogant to think that we're perfect, and therefore we rely on your graciousness, oh God. But the essence of confession is to actually say, I have sinned. And that is most explicitly stated in the Ashamnu. I have sinned, I did iniquity, and we go through all the sins. So if you want to get to the essence of confessional, you have to actually enumerate the sins you've done. And that does exactly that. Whereas the other ones are manners in which beseeching Hashem forgiveness for we have sinned. But they aren't the essence kernel in terms of like a halachic technicality of did you confess? And whereas the Chatanu is quite explicit. I have sinned. Where the other paragraphs are, an appeal to God's graciousness to forgiveness. So perhaps that's why that's the primary of the confessional. We'll stop over here. And tomorrow, God willing, we get to Ne'ilah prayer and also comparing it to other times here. We do 3 prayers, 4 prayers, 5 prayers. And maybe we'll talk about the spirituality of that when we get there as well. For the next Masechta, keep in mind. Yes, I'll put to you what I do every time we finish Masechta. So far at this table, our learning has usually been split between one of 2 things. Either learning that has some practical relevance to halacha. We've gone that route many times. Or we've done things that are of agada, inspiration, in which we've tried our best to weave Hasidic ideas into them. With this last chapter, we got both. Right, we got the practical halacha of the laws of Yom Kippur, which we got to finish, thank God, before Yom Kippur started. And then we also got into Teshuvah, which had lots of Hasidic ideas, Midrashic ideas, spiritual ideas, and so on. So I put it to you, to which way you want to go. The more spiritual type of Gemara, which has lessons and life and spiritual ideas, Midrashic ideas, or the more practical halacha, or we go a whole new route to begin with. We can go just, pulpul, as you say, Gemara, just doing legal analysis on hypotheticals. But I'd rather stick to one of those 2. Either the halacha, bring something that's relevant to halacha, or some sort of midrashic spiritualistic idea. So I have some things in mind, and give some thought too. One idea I'm thinking of is Saita. Saita has a lot of midrashic parts to it. It has some parts that are theoretical because the laws of the Saita itself, a woman whose husband is jealous of her and she has a whole process, that those laws are not practiced today. So that part is going to be hypothetical, but there are lots of spiritual messaging in there, and it concludes with very strong prophecies about Mashiach's coming. Actually, specifically the era, the generation preceding Mashiach's coming, which is very fascinating. That's an option. And another option I'm thinking of is Sukkah. which is mostly halachic. Mostly halachic. Oh, you did sukkah already?
I did half a sukkah, and it was very tough.
There's a lot of it technical halachic with math.
To go through. I went up with Rabbi to share we did twice a week. It was very hard.
So there's a lot of technical.
It was long and
yeah.
There's a lot of calculations.
There's a lot of math and there's a lot of halacha. So there's that option.
Yeah,
so maybe we'll go with Saita.
It was very hard. I realized
yeah.
you have to be in the right mindset for it.
There's a lot of arithmetic.
And in the mornings,
yeah.
This is at night.
Yeah, so maybe Saita or any other ideas you're bringing up? Maybe. We've also talked once here about doing Avodah Zarah. We never ended up doing it. Avodah Zarah also has a lot of hypotheticals. A lot of hypotheticals because most of the laws of Avodah Zarah aren't practiced today. But it has a lot of also spiritual messages and things like that. So anyway, I'll leave it to your consideration. We'll ask how many things also. Okay, a wonderful day.